All right. Well, welcome once again. My name is Kathy Terrell, and I know the technology is a little confusing to everybody, so I hope you can all follow along with my presentation today. It's new to me too, so we're all in this together, as I keep saying and keep telling us. But today we are going to have our presentation, our Meet Us in the Garden presentation is going to be dealing with minimizing animal damage in our yards. So once again, Ohio State University Extension is comprised of our Family and Consumer Science group, the 4-H and Youth Development area, Community Development, and Agriculture and Natural Resources. It's our little commercial here for Ohio State. And there's our website. You can go to ohioline.osu.edu any time of day or night, and you're able to find a lot of good information. It's a good resource for you to use. So once again, today we're talking about wildlife. So we want to learn a little bit about the wildlife that we share our yards with, and that's where we're going today. And we also want to help keep them out of our yards a little bit if we can. So we have all been spending a lot of time at home this year. And a lot of us have been spending many more hours in our gardens because we can. This beautiful landscape was my mother-in-law's former house. Beautiful. She did a beautiful job. It has been a very good year for gardens. This is our very own Peace Garden at the Lake County Fairgrounds. I should say our former Peace Garden, because it is now a work in progress. The grounds have been worked on, the building's been rebuilt, and now we have to put the gardens back together again. These are some inspiration shots that I wanted to share with you because it has been a very good year for gardening. If nothing else, it's been very warm. Our plants love that, our tropicals and most of our other plants. These are not my yard, by the way, but they are beautiful and inspiration shots that I wanted to share with you. Maybe some of us have had too much time in our gardens. Here is a beautiful flower garden, a very beautiful ornamental garden, and our vegetable gardens too are very beautiful and a good resource for us to spend our time in this year. Perhaps you like a very formal look in your garden. A formal look does take some time to groom and prune and shape. And if you've had a lot of time this year, maybe this has been the look for you. Or perhaps you went way overboard and did something like this in your yard. Not me. I am more for the informal type of garden, which we have on our next slide. Informal, random plantings, and not that it's any less maintenance, but it's a different kind of maintenance. We have groups of plants. We have encouraged certain native plants perhaps, but it is a more casual look and it doesn't take as much grooming as a formal garden. We might like to put a lot of plants together. I do this in my own yard to try to keep the soil to a minimum so that it discourages weeds from occurring and creating a space in our gardens. This actually is a picture of my garden in the springtime. It is a heavily wooded area. I live in Mentor, and we do get a lot of different animals in our yards. But there's one thing, as beautiful as our gardens can be, that we don't want to see in our yards, and that is animal damage. So no matter what type of garden style you prefer, we do want to invite wildlife in, but we don't like the damage that they incur. So I guess we can't have it both ways, but I'm here today to talk to you about how we can minimize that damage and perhaps give you a few tricks to help you deal with the animals that visit our yards. So today we are going to be addressing some of the most common animals that visit our gardens. We have the chipmunk, the eastern chipmunk. We have our skunk. We have our raccoon bandit, whitetail deer, the eastern cottontail rabbit, and our moles and voles. We're going to be addressing these animals specifically, but I also wanted to touch base about woodchucks that might visit our gardens. Woodchucks are also known as groundhogs, whistle pigs, perhaps you might have heard the expression. They actually prefer the same type of plants that the deer and the rabbits frequent and visit. So any physical barriers that you use for deer or rabbit will also help with the woodchuck. Deer are, they like to eat off the shoots and flowers and trim the plants as they go. The rabbits are more like browsers, and they'll nibble a little bit here or there, but those groundhogs are just like mowing machines in our gardens and our yards. So in this next section, I like to call this section, Know Your Enemy, because as gardeners, we feel like these animals are indeed our enemy, or they're hurtful to our yards and our plants. So we're going to learn a little bit about them. We're going to learn about their habits and their diet, the periods of when they're active, and we'll also address some ways we can curb their eagerness to visit our gardens. And hopefully by learning a little bit about them, we can deter their visits to our yard. So here we go. Our first animal of concern is, oh, isn't he cute? It's the little eastern chipmunk. He is our friendly backyard visitor, and he is cute. Look at those puffy cheeks. But he can do a lot of damage. They like to uproot dig up bulbs and eat bulbs. They will uproot things in pots. They'll create a lot of holes in your garden. And this is where they go to burrow. So he's small, but he's mighty, and he can do a mighty bit of damage. He is also a food hoarder. Look at those cheeks. That is all the room that he's got for food in his cheeks. So he does actually try to hoard his food and store it for the winter when he's not as active. So let's take a better look at the eastern chipmunk's bio, so to speak. He is an omnivore. He does eat fruits, seeds, nuts, sometimes worms, slugs, bugs, bird eggs, and mushrooms. They live in those connecting underground burrows, which are 2-inch diameter holes. They're most active early in the morning or the late afternoon, and they do a lot of damage by digging up flowers and plants, and also sometimes uprooting things in your garden. Their range is approximately a ½ acre. So guess what? You might want to think of them as your personal outdoor pets, because they're not going anywhere. They are highly territorial, and they defend their burrows. One chipmunk can gather up to 165 acorns a day. He's very hungry. They're not true hibernators. You know, they'll fill their cheeks up with seeds or grains or bugs, whatever they're eating that day. And what they're going to do then is hoard it in their burrows. You might see them come out of their burrows in the wintertime. They're not true hibernators. They will come out on a nice, pleasant day in search of a new catch of food. So that's our eastern chipmunk. Our next animal of concern is the eastern cottontail rabbit. They too are cute little animals, but they can also do a lot of damage to our yard. Here are some of the damage that a rabbit can incur on our plants and our crops. We'll see a lot of their damage more as winter approaches, because in the winter season, all these animals are striving to survive. So they'll be doing things like this, stripping the bark off of your shrubs and bushes and trees. Right now they're cutting off the fresh, tender shoots out of our vegetable garden, whatever we might have left in our gardens at this point before we put them to bed for the year. They also are stripping the bark on these trees in hopes to get some nutrients and vitamins. Now, this slide I have included because this is a good example of showing how a deer will chew off a twig or a branch. They make a very clean cut. It's very precise at a 45-degree angle. Whereas a deer is just pulling and chewing, doesn't have the as much control when he comes through and browses in your yard. So if you see animal damage and it's a clean cut like this, it's probably a deer. Also, you notice that the damage is low to the ground. Another clue: most deer are not going to be down there. They're going to be up on top of the bushes and the shrubs. So that's our little rabbit damage in our yards. A little bit more about him is he is an herbivore. He eats only plants, but he'll eat a very big variety of plants: weeds, grasses, twigs, etc. So he lives in brush piles, thickets, and burrows. We want to know where he lives so we can probably deter those places in our yard to try to get him to move maybe down the street, down the road into another area of your development. They are active at sunrise and sunset, and they do eat tender plants, and they do a lot of damage to our winter shrubs. Most of them will live anywhere from 2 to 5 years. But in that period, one pair of cottontail rabbits can produce as many as 350,000 babies with a mortality rate of almost 0. They do remain active all year. They only move short distances, and they run in a zigzag kind of pattern. They up to 18 miles an hour. So they don't have a lot of they have a lot of natural enemies. They're hiders. Their eyes are on the side of their head. So they don't attack, or they're not hunters, they're hiders. So that's a little bit about an eastern cottontail rabbit. Remember, we got to get to know these enemies so we know how to take care of them in our yards and gardens. The next up is our Raccoon Bandit. And look at him. They're so cute when they have the litter of their little pups in the spring. They do climb trees. Some people don't realize that, but they do climb into brush to escape barking dogs, etc. But look at those hands, very dexterous hands. They can even open garbage cans. So even if you put your garbage in your can, you might have a visitor from that Raccoon Bandit. The damage that they cause is can be pretty extensive. They too are stripping the barks of the trees, perhaps when they're active on those winter days. They're looking for more insects and grubs and bugs, unlike the rabbit, who is just an herbivore. They will dig in your yard, in your garden, in your lawn in search of ground insects, grubs, and bugs. And they'll also love to visit your vegetable garden. The frustrating thing about them visiting your garden, you might see that they've pulled this tomato right off, or they might have left it on the vine like this and just taken a bite or two. But it's very frustrating to us gardeners when we have slaved and, groomed these tomatoes to be the best they can, fertilize them, water them, baby them, and then along comes the raccoon, and there goes our tomato meal. So it's very disheartening. So a little bit more about their raccoon. He is an omnivore. He'll eat both plants, animals, veggies, and anything that he can find in your garbage. They live in warm, dry, quiet places. Think about brush or leaf piles beneath your decks or sheds again. They are nocturnal, which means they're active at night mostly. The damage that they can do is, like we said, they'll raid garbage cans. They'll even eat pet or bird food left outside. They'll go visit your bird feeders. They'll go through your vegetable garden. They are active year-round, but the most damage that they incur is usually in late winter or early spring when they are seeking out new nesting sites. A raccoon can live about 10 years in the wild, and the average weight of them can be between 10 and 35 pounds, so they can get very large. They also are carriers for rabies, so be careful with those raccoons. Our next creature feature is the skunk. He is a common visitor to our yard, probably in the last couple of weeks going into fall. Even before that, if you have any insects in your soils, in your lawns, this guy is going to be looking for them, because that's what he's eating. He's eating the grubs and the soil insects in your yards and gardens, and you'll see the damage that they do. He has a lot of personality, very, very much. And by personality, I mean he's got a lot of sense. When I look about the grubs, when I look at treating my yard for grubs, I think about how many grubs can I take in my square footage. So this year, I just treated my front yard for the grubs because we had more than 5 per square foot. But my backyard, which is very rough and more natural, even though I had a few more than 5, I did not treat most areas, and they came through it okay. We had a little digging here or there. So you're going to want to think about what you really want to do as far as taking care of the problems that you're encountering in your garden. So a little bit more about the skunks. They are carnivores, so they eat fruit, berries, bugs, grubs. They'll eat mice and even pet food if it's left outside. They set up their nests under porches, sheds, in old logs or wood piles, and they dig their own burrows. They may have as many as 10 nests throughout their range, and their range can be up to 1 mile. They are most often active at dusk or dawn. So here's a good new word that I learned too, crepuscular. That means you're active at dusk or dawn, like the rabbits or the skunks. That's when they're out and about getting their food sources for their next meal. They do damage to our lawns and gardens by digging mostly, and they are digging for insects in our soils. They are not territorial. So in the wintertime, they will often cozy up with other skunks to keep warm. Their spray, which is their defense mechanism, by the way, can shoot up to 15 feet. And the breeding season for them is usually February till mid-April. And this is the most common time for dogs to get sprayed by a skunk. So just be aware of that. Also, the only animal that is an enemy of the skunk is the great horned owl. He's the only one who is a predator for the skunk because he has no sense of smell. The #1 killer of skunks, however, is the automobile. So yeah, I don't know if that's any concern to you, but that does happen. Just a little thought too, as I was looking at the information here, think about your skunks and raccoons as working from the top of your landscape down into the soils. Because the next set of animals we're going to talk about work from underneath your soils and underneath your grasses. So that brings us to another cute little animal of concern. And he is very small. This is an eastern mole. He's a small mammal, and I don't know if you can see it, but this is somebody's hand. They're holding the mole. Here's his front feet, here's his back feet, and that's his nose. You can hardly see eyes because they're so tiny, because moles really don't see very well. That's why they burrow through the ground in search of mostly earthworms. So the earthworm, that is their 80% of their diet. They do eat grubs and other insects, but they're mostly after the worms. But he can do a lot of damage. And his holes look a lot like the chipmunk holes. They're about the same size, but you probably won't ever see an eastern mole, maybe in a flash, because they are shy and they dash from their hole to hole, whereas chipmunks are more bold and you'll see them kind of going in and out of their holes. Let's take a look at our next slide. It's a better picture of the eastern mole. Look at him. He looks blind. He's pretty blind. His eyes are very minimal on the sides of his head, but his claws are digging machines. So he does dig a lot of series of tunnels and burrows through the soil. This is a picture of him going down in a hole. It's really hard to tell, but he's a very small creature, weighing in at maybe, I don't know, 5 ounces. So it's really a small hole that you're seeing them in. This creature also lives here in our area. This is called a Starnose mole. And this mole, does like to live in more damp soils, more different parts of our environment. So the Starnose mole will dig deeper into the soil, about 6 inches down or more, where the eastern mole tunnels, his tunnels are more shallow. So that's a little bit of difference about the Starnose mole and the eastern mole, both common into our area. Now, as a bonus, we're going to talk about, I've included a little information about the voles, because sometimes people confuse moles and voles. There are big differences between the two and the damage that they do. So a vole looks like more like a mouse. You can see his eyes. He's got distinct ears. He's got smaller claws than the mole. The mole, you can't see his eyes. You really can't see his ears. He has big front feet. He eats worms, grubs, and insects, and he leaves behind mounds of dirt. We already talked about what he does and the damage he can incur by his tunnels. But the vole, and he only, think about our mole, only eats worms, grubs, and insects in the ground. The vole, on the other hand, eats everything it sees. It eats roots, it eats plants, it eats leaves, and it stems. So the damage that they occur is much greater than the mole, I'm sorry. So that is our vole. And here's a difference about the damage that is incurred by either one. The mole here, his tunnels are underground and he's kicking up the dirt to try to get to those worms. And the vole damage is extensive. He's actually got tunnels chewed in the grass, and this could result in our lawn being damaged by the chewing channels in our grass. So a little bit more a difference here. The moles are carnivores, so they're only eating insects and grubs and worms. The voles are omnivores. They'll eat everything, including plants and roots. The moles live underground. The voles live everywhere. Moles are active at dawn and late evening because they can't see very well, so they don't really have good vision to see, so they're used to being in their burrows and their holes. The voles are active, dependent on the species, day and night. So you never know. If you're seeing voles, you're going to see probably a lot of them. The damage that a vole does can be extensive, and the damage a mole does is really only to it's underground tunnels and the debris that they kick up when they're digging. The voles look like tiny mouse, like a field mouse, and a lot of them live in colonies or groups, where the moles are solitary. So they don't do a lot of damage, just to give you a word of information there. So the next animal that we have of concern is the whitetail deer. And he's probably the biggest animal, largest animal that visits our yards. He can be majestic and grand, or petite and cute. But there's one thing for sure, they do a lot of damage. Deer love hosta. They eat plants, and this one is very satisfied with what he's eating over here, the hosta. He's kind of nipped it down to the ground. Another way deer do damage is by deer rubbings. They are rubbing the bark off of these trees. Sometimes this happens in the winter into late spring when they're shedding their antlers and growing new ones. So you might find them if you're taking a walk in the early spring. You might find a set of antlers under this tree. These trees are also rubbed by deer. I could show you better pictures from my yard because we have a lot of deer activity in my yard. And when the deer actually ring a tree like this by rubbing it, it will kill the tree. And because it's cut off the vascular system of water and nutrients to the tree. So it's a hard thing, but deer are really tough on trees. And a lot of times it's not like they're just frolicking through your yard sometimes, and they'll be playful, and they're, especially in the rut in November, they'll come through and you might see a whole herd of them, young males, and they are very busy frolicking through your trees and your shrubs and everything. So that's another example of how deer can do damage to our yard. They also eat everything. There isn't anything that, I mean, there are more native plants that we try that to put in our gardens that will help us survive some deer damage, but they will eat a lot of things. If they're hungry, it's there to be eaten and they have to survive. So they'll eat hollies and twigs and tulips. They are eating machines. A deer can also stand up to about a height of 6 foot. They go on their hind legs. So if you're you think, who did this damage? But it's probably the deer. The deer is, as the bush was growing up, the deer is just very interested in getting the tender shoots. So that's what he's eating. A little bit more about our deer. They are herbivores. They eat only plants, twigs and bark, berries, fruit and nuts. They live in meadows, forested woodlands, brushy areas, and your backyard. Their range is up to 1 mile. Most of them are active more at dawn or dusk. So once again, they too are crepuscular. They'll eat most any plant material at any time. When they're hungry, they're hungry. And we already said that if they rub a small tree, shrub, or even a large tree and they ring it, it will kill the tree. The deer can run very fast. They run up to about 40 miles an hour, and they can jump about 10 feet vertically. They have been known to eat up to a variety of 500 different kinds of plants. They even eat mushrooms that are poisonous to humans. They have a 4-chambered stomach, which helps them eat very tough plants like your hollies and things like that. They'll chew the plant, spit it up, and chew it again. The average age of a deer is 5 years. And males can weigh anywhere between 100 to 300 pounds, and females anywhere from 75 to 200 pounds. So those are our enemies, a little bit about them. And what are we gonna do now? What's a homeowner to do? Traps? Bait? Shotguns? Well, before we go that route, let's take a minute to figure out which animal or animals are creating the damage in our yards. How much damage is occurring and what is a realistic expectation? How do we want to proceed? Do we have a lot of damage? Do we have a little damage? We want to share with you the options and some of the things we can do. So we've gotten to know our enemy. Now we're going to take a look at try to figure out who did the damage. Maybe you saw who did the damage, maybe you didn't. So the first thing we want to do is take a closer look and assess the damage. Do you see the 45-degree angle twigs on your winter shrubs and trees? An animal attacked that tree. Is it pulled off, ripped off ends on the shrubs or trees or twigs? A deer probably attacked that tree. So we want to find out who did it before we know what to do next. We want to gather evidence. Do you see scat in your yard? Do you see tracks? Do you see animals digging? Next is, how big of a problem is it for you? Is it something that you can live with? Is the impact minimal on your yard? Or do you have like a whole variety of hostas and they're just coming through, animals are coming through and mowing them all down? Did you see an animal dodging down into the burrow? Is it something we want to consider? And we want to consider what our options might be and the cost of those options and how realistic we need to be taking care of the animal problem that we have in our yards. Can you adjust your habits? Can you move the bird feeders? Put a brick on your garbage can so the raccoons' little hands can't get in there and get to your garbage. Can you move some of your plants up closer to the house? Maybe you have better options to defend your area. So let's take a look at some of the management techniques that we're going to talk about to deal with all of these critters that visit our yard. So the first one of the first management techniques we have is habitat modification, scare tactics. Like I said, habitat modification, we're either modifying our behaviors or the animals or both. So those are the things we're going to look at these in detail as we go. The second management technique we have is exclusion of the animal by fencing or various means. The third management technique is repellents. There are 3 types of repellents: those that taste bad to the animal, those that smell bad to the animal, and a combination thereof. And then there's the final management technique is trapping or removing the animal. So let's think about what to do. Let's see how each of these techniques can be used. And we're going to take a look at each one of them as we go. Maybe we have to use 1 or 2 management techniques in conjunction to help solve our problems in our garden. So habitat modification. Remember, I said it's not only modifying the animals' habits, but ours too. Can we remove the brush piles from our yards so we can discourage animals living in them? Can we secure our garbage? I think we can do those things. We can control our environment a little bit by cleaning up the grubs in our lawn and learning to live with maybe a small percentage of insects in our soils. We can even move our watering and feeding our pets indoors. We might want to remove our bird baths if it's become a real problem and all we're doing is now feeding the deer instead of the birds. Maybe you want to put up a bird bath instead. One thing that I do in the fall right now, I've been doing it for about a month, is clean up the fruits and nuts falling from my trees, my hickory, my oak. The animals are still getting a lot of that food, but I'm just trying to discourage some of their movement through my yard. We can also grow garlic, perhaps, and marigolds around our gardens. They have strong odors and scents that animals find offensive. Place some chicken wire over beds when planting the bulbs so the wire is actually buried. It avoids those little chipmunks creating burrows and tunnels down to get your bulbs. And don't feed your bulbs with bone meal or fish emulsion because the smells do attract wildlife for that reason. We also might want to think about enclosing our decks and our sheds, the areas under and around our decks and sheds, so animals don't find it very conducive to have a home there. So scare tactics, yeah, some work, some don't work. And those aluminum pans hanging, they don't work. Animals, especially deer, get very used to seeing the things we humans try to protect our yards with. So they're not as effective as you would think. Even birds don't find them very effective to keep birds off of our vegetables and fruits, trees, things like that. A barking dog is sometimes a very good deterrent to animals that are visiting your yard. They learn modified behavior. They'll change their paths and their patterns. If they see a dog barking through the yard all the time, or if you have a herd of running kids or a lot of action in your yard, it's probably not very conducive to these animals. It kind of scares them away. Most of them are on the shy side. Coyotes are our biggest predator here. They really are not something that we can count on, that's for sure. They will take out some of our small animals. Also, I have a friendly hawks in my neighborhood that take care of some of the moles and voles, and I know they can do other damage to, baby birds or nests and things, but it's a balance of nature in an equilibrium kind of thing. So we have to be cognizant of that too. We have new devices on the market that will try to either turn on the lights or warn an alarm, or anyway, some of these things are effective. Now my neighbor has one with lights, and the deer just love it because as the deer walk past the lights come on and they can see better where they're going. So can be very expensive and not always effective. So be forewarned about that scare tactic. What about your husband or a neighbor with a gun, a BB gun? BB guns are permissible, and I do know people that use them, and they do scare some of these animals away. Our next management technique is exclusion, fencing. Fencing around your specific area of your garden, like a vegetable garden, that's pretty practical to do. This is a nicely fenced area, and it's got a board for added protection for those animals that like to dig under the fence. If you don't have a board in your garden and you have a fence, perhaps you want to consider taking your fence and bending it horizontal and at the soil level or slightly below, and burying that horizontal line of fencing. This does prevent animals from digging right by the fence. So that is one way to help, or the board will do the same thing. Sometimes we can't put the fences up around our whole yard. It's just not practical or realistic. So even though it might be a nice option, we might want to fence everything in to keep this guy out. It's not a practical option. These type of fences, board on board or solid fencing, do deter deer from jumping over them. I guess the weapony kind of like points on the top would also deter the deer, but the deer do not like to jump where they can't see where they're going. So solid fence is a good one for them to prevent them from jumping over. Remember, deer jump vertically. They jump up. They don't have to jump horizontally. So they jump very high. And here's another example of exclusion of those deer rubbings and rabbits perhaps stripping the bark of the tree, or the raccoons by wrapping your tender trees in some fencing or proper tree guards. So when we talk about fencing, we want to make sure the fences are installed high enough. A deer can leap over a 7-foot high fence. And so an 8 to 10 foot fence is really the best control. And for most of us, that's not an option. Remember, I said the deer can jump vertically, so they jump up. A double row of fencing is helpful, but we don't usually go to that extent either. I have used fencing successfully in a horizontal manner where I'm actually laying it on the ground through my ornamental beds. What that does is it prevents the deer from, they trip up on the fencing as they're walking through. It basically breaks their path. They'll find another way through, but they don't want to get their feet stuck into the fencing. So it will break their path a little bit. So what can we do to deter these deer? Just so you know, most of the deer damage does occur in late fall through the early spring when their animals' natural food sources are scarce. So at that time of year, they will eat bark, twigs, any berries left over, your bird food from your feeder. A mature buck consumes between 4 to 10 pounds of food each day. Remember, he's only eating plants, as well as the nuts and buds and twigs. So he's got to eat a lot of things every day to survive. Deer are creatures of habit. Once they establish pathways or feeding area, it is difficult to deter them. And you really have a battle to try to break their habits. They are adaptable and they learn very quickly. I know I've had them as I'm coming into my area, my development, they wait for cars to drive down the road, and then they cross behind us. They have learned our ways very well. So sometimes you might have to use a combination of control strategies, the best way to limit the deer damage. And although no one plant is 100% deer proof, many plants are deer resistant. First off, pick your battles. Place your netting over your hostas. In the spring, when your daylily buds come up, you're going to want to net those. Then you could probably remove the netting, but once they start flowering again, you're going to want to get your sprays out or your fencing or whatever, because daylilies too are very yummy to the deer. So we want to make sure that we are taking care of some of these problems with our fencing. It's another way to deter the deer. Now, another management technique is the repellents. Repellents can work, but they'll need to be reapplied at various stages of the plant growth. Those tender shoots of the daylily, once again at flower time or bud, because deer will come through. There are commercial repellents out there. Like I said, they act in 3 different ways. Smell, odor, or combination, smell, taste, or combination of the 3. You can hang soap, things like that do act as repellents. Some people make their homemade repellents, and that's okay too, using garlic or putrefied eggs, hard eggs, things like that. So whatever works. And sometimes you might have to interchange the repellents you use because they do become ineffective over time. Use at the first sign of damage. Apply to tender shoots on windless 40-degree days and higher temperatures, or they're not that effective if they're drifting away or if the temperature is too cold. Reapply after the rain and change the type of repellent to be the most effective. So with that being said, the last and final thing we can do is trap or remove these critters. And for some of us, this is a last resort. So do you want to call a trapper? Probably the best thing you can do is call a trapper, because you cannot deal with the skunk once they're in a cage like this. They will spray, and it's hard to get that spray off of anything. But I want to caution you that you need to know the law about trapping and removing, because in most cases, if you trap an animal, that in most cases you will have to euthanize the animal. That's what the trappers do. You cannot, there's no such thing as trap and release. That used to happen way back in the day. But if you remove the animal to another property, you have to do it with the property owner's consent. So just remember to know the law. So in summary, I want you to think about, we have taken the time to create wildlife-friendly yards and landscapes. But now we have to take a step back and learn the ways of the animals. What makes our yard a little more uninviting for them? And let's get rid of those leaf piles. Check under your decks and sheds. Try to keep those areas open and clear so animals don't find it friendly to live there. Use repellents before the damage is found, and reapply often. Fencing and barriers are good. Leave them up. Don't take them down once spring comes. Animals are still moving around looking for food. Remove them gradually as you need to. But remember to be persistent, because the wildlife they need to eat out there every day. And we have created wonderful places for them to exist. So in closing, I just want to say, on the brighter side, it could always be worse. At least we don't have those proverbial elephants in our rooms or gardens. Thank you for attending. And I think Tom will